Hey everybody, welcome to Cats and Court TV. Here with the latest and greatest and sometimes hated info updates of the most high-profile cases going on around the country. This is your girl, Miss Public Info, here with you for the third time today. We have a special episode, special edition of Cats and Court TV. Has been breaking news on the uh, Sean Combs case. As you recall, last Thursday, Sean Combs had a hearing in front of Judge Submarinian, who is the trial court judge for his RICO case, which of course he was acquitted of most of the counts with the exception of the two Mann Act charges. Now, his attorneys on last Thursday had a hearing with Judge Submarinian where they basically pleaded for Sean Combs's case. This was considered in legal circles, and I've said this on the last episode we did earlier today. This uh, this hearing and the request for an acquittal or a new trial was considered a Hail Mary pass in legal circles. These kinds of post conviction, early post conviction requests are usually denied. And this one is no different. This request was denied. The denial came in just probably about 15 minutes ago. Judge Submarinian made his ruling through a filing. He did not post another hearing. There was not a subsequent hearing to discuss his ruling on this. He ruled in writing, and we're going to talk about that. Now, if you recall, the issue at hand from Sean Combs's attorneys was the actual definition of prostitution that was being used to actually convict him on the Mann Act charges. Now, historically, the Mann Act was sort of enacted back in the mid to late 1800s to essentially keep Black men from having sexual relations with white women. But essentially, what the Mann Act said back then was that a woman could not have sex with someone that was not her husband. So essentially, in order to be charged and convicted with the Mann Act back in those days, it was considered illegal if you went cross state lines or had or arranged for transportation of a white woman to basically have sexual contact with her. It was basically born out of racism, SCXism, all of the things. But since then, and since those things are no longer illegal in terms of Black men, white women, or anybody of any race being having a relationship with one another, and those things are no longer an issue in the courts, the Mann Act has since the statute has been updated for to include prostitution. That's what prostitution as it is commonly known now in modernized times, basically aiding or contributing to or facilitating to the travel for an sex worker of any sex to participate in commercial sex for money, essentially. And that is what the court during this trial was charging Sean Combs with, and that's what he was subsequently convicted of. Now, the issue with Sean Combs's team was that they felt that the Mann Act should have been defined as it was originally defined back in the mid to 1800s, and that he should have been tried on the Mann Act based on that definition, not based on the more modernized definition. They also, in this hearing on Thursday, confusingly said while he shouldn't have been tried under the definition as more known more modernly, that he also should not have been convicted of the Mann Act because he was not a participant of sex with the workers, but that he was a pornography producer, as it were. That he was not in any way, shape, or form guilty of having sex with these male sex workers or any sex workers for that matter, that he is innocent of that. The the DOJ came in and said, well, that is not what the issue is. Number one, the issue is that Sean Combs, per the statute, was involved in facilitating the travel, the transportation, cross state lines around the country, even internationally, of sex workers for commercial paid sex. And that is illegal. And that is what he was convicted of. So let's get into the filing and let's hear the reasonings behind Judge Submaranian's denial for this request. Now, those of you who just wanted it quick and dirty and y'all are done with that, thank you so much for joining us on this edition for Casting Court TV. Don't forget to subscribe and like, and please support the channel. Support for this channel goes to all of the legal documents that I subsequently have to purchase to give you the news that you want to hear. In this case and many other cases that we cover here on Casting Court TV. So please, if you are so inclined to, please support the channel. Appreciate you always, all of you, and appreciate you for watching as well. Now, let's get into the actual reasoning behind Judge Submaranian's ruling. Now that we've covered the background of all of that, and you know where this is all coming from. Now, Judge Submaranian says after an 8-week trial, a jury convicted Sean Combs of 2 counts of transporting people for prostitution under the Mann Act. They go into the Mann Act, and he said he says that Combs renewed his motion after the verdict. He also moved for a new trial under Rule 33, and then he says and outlines that for the following reasons, both motions are denied. Acquittal was the request, as well as, if not an acquittal, a new trial. Now he goes into the background, which we've already covered. And so we go into all of that. Now the legal standards. So we don't need to go and repeat what we said. I covered that for you. So on the defendant's motion, a court must enter a judgment of acquittal of any offense for which the evidence is insufficient to sustain a conviction. He goes on and says, evidence is insufficient to sustain a conviction only if it is non-existent or so meager that no reasonable jury could find guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. As the Second Circuit has explained, a defendant challenging the sufficiency of the evidence bears a heavy burden because the reviewing court is required to draw all permissible inferences in favor of the government and resolve all issues of credibility in favor of the jury verdict. And what does that mean? It simply means that basically, in order to prove that the ruling has insufficient evidence, which is what he would need to prove that an acquittal is needed here, that it would have to be the evidence would of the burden to find such evidence would be very burdensome, and that it would have to include evidence that would basically be like what they presented to convict him on these counts would have to be evidence that was either meager, so that it's not reasonable that the jury found him guilty of it, or non-existent altogether. Judge Submaranian also goes on to explain that the defendant, Mr. Combs, challenging the sufficiency of the evidence bears an extremely heavy burden because the reviewing court has to automatically rule, or review rather, in favoring the actual the government in this particular case, because of the jury trial, because the jury has already convicted him. So while he's reviewing this, he has to review it actually with some prejudice, because the law says, the Second Circuit Court says that while reviewing, it is required for you, the judge, to draw all permissible inferences in favor of the government and resolve any issues of credibility in favor of the jury verdict. So bringing this kind of request, Sean Combs was already behind the eight ball from the beginning, is basically what he's saying. He goes on and he says that under the Rule 33, which is the federal rule of criminal procedure, he says upon the defendant's motion, the court may vacate any judgment and grant a new trial if the interest of justice so requires. Generally, the court has broader discretion to grant a new trial under Rule 33 than to than to grant a motion for acquittal under Rule 29. But it nonetheless must exercise the Rule 33 authority sparingly and in the most extraordinary circumstances. Now, this goes to what I said earlier in the earlier episode, that usually these post-conviction requests like this one are normally denied because of the fact, number one, as the judge so said already, they're looking at it in favor of the jury trial resolution, which was they convicted him. Secondly, they're usually denied because of the fact that they have to do so sparingly. So says the law. And it has to be under extremely extraordinary circumstances. It almost never happens. And the only times in which it would happen is if there was an extreme amount of prosecutorial errors in the trial court phase that was done by the Department of Justice. Okay. And this is, if you were to read the filing, you would see all of the precedents, the court filing precedents here that sort of shows you all of that, and all of the quoting that he did from actual case law showing, giving proof, backing up his argument. He goes on to say that at the same time, the court may not wholly usurp the jury's role. And so that's another thing, that another reason why they sparingly give these kinds of rulings is because there is a lot of honor and prestige and respect for the jury's decision. So the court may not usurp the jury's role and come in and be like, oh, well, we don't care what the jury says. We're getting a new trial, unless there was some huge line of error. And in this particular case, there was not, according to Judge Submaranian. Part of that is to exercise the court's job is to exercise its discretion. And the court may weigh the evidence and credibility of the witnesses when trying to decide whether or not a request like this should be approved or denied. And according to Judge Submaranian, there was enough evidence. There was enough credibility to the witnesses on these two particular convictions. Okay. Now let's get into some of the arguments where the judge is kind of, giving. Judge Submaranian is very surgical with his answers to his filings. So he gives a lot of legal background, a lot of legal jargon and case law in a lot of his filings. He does do some commentary, obviously, but it's harder for me to pick out the commentary because he is very surgical with his decisions. He hits you with the case law, and that is what sort of backs this up for him. And now we understand, or I understand rather, why he was not able to deliver this decision on Thursday, Friday, and he took the weekend to go over this, and coming with it late here on Tuesday evening, because it is very front loaded with a lot of case law here. He has a lot here to sort of cement his denial. Okay, so we're going to get into this. Okay, now, the legal arguments per the judge. This is what he's saying on the Rule 29 arguments. And so that you understand, Rule 29 was the acquittal. Okay. This was the request for to acquit. The new trial uh request was for the Rule 33. And the Rule 29 is subsequently harder than the Rule 33. Okay. The legal arguments in Combs's Rule 29 motion turn on what the word prostitution means in the Mann Act. The act has two clauses, but share the same act element, transporting somebody in interstate or foreign commerce. But they have different intent requirements. The first clause, the one at issue here, requires that the defendant intend that the transported person engage in prostitution, which is the SEX worker did. The second clause, a broader catch-all, requires that the defendant intended for the transported person to engage in any sexual activity for which any person can be charged with a criminal defense. And he says, together they read as follows: whoever knowingly transports any individual in interstate or foreign commerce or in any territory or possession of the United States with intent that such individual engage in prostitution or in any sexual activity for which any person can be charged with a criminal offense. He goes on and he says what? But at trial, Combs proposed that the jury instruction define prostitution as engaging in sexual activity for money or its equivalent. And so the court adopted Combs's definition in its instructions to the jury, which proceeded to convict Combs under that very definition. What is he saying? He's saying, well, Combs's defense team argued to have the jury instructions define prostitution a certain kind of way. And that certain kind of way was engaging in sexual activity for money or its equivalent. And so based on those jury instructions, which was a creation out of Combs's own defense team, he was convicted of that. And he says, but now, after he was convicted, Combs changed his mind. And he said now he's arguing that his own proposed definition was wrong all along. He's saying now you want to change it only because you were convicted. And this is exactly what I said to you guys. If you go back a couple of episodes, I talk about the fact that Sean Combs had every opportunity to fix this particular definition. He had pretrial conference time, and of course he had the jury instruction time, which apparently he did. But he's only having issues with the definition now because he was convicted. I made this very same argument 2 episodes ago because I knew this would be a problem. And this is exactly what Judge Submaranian is using in his reasoning for the denial in Rule 29 for the acquittal. He goes on and he says, prostitution, he says, meaning Combs, instead now requires either that the defendant have a commercial motive or that the buyer has sex with the seller, or both. That would mean that there was never any prostitution involving Combs, who lacked a financial motive and didn't directly have sex with any of the men he hired. And he goes on, he says, on his telling, applying a broader definition would create constitutional problems. And these arguments don't hold water for the reasons below. And then he goes further to say why Combs, his challenge on his own definition that he actually created during the jury instruction, why it doesn't hold water. He says Combs didn't forfeit or waive these challenges. This is what I said in the original, when I said in these first episodes ago. He says, the first question is whether Combs can bring a legal challenge to his conviction on Rule 29. He said the government contends that Combs should have made this challenge earlier. Like I said to you guys, why is he bringing it up now? Because he was convicted. He said, Judge Submaranian is essentially saying, why didn't he bring this up earlier? And when he didn't bring this up earlier under Rule 12, he forfeited them. And then he says, at that, the instruction given to the jury on the definition of prostitution was of his own devising, that his team made it up. And so he waives any claim of error because your defense team are the ones who actually came up with what definition the jury was actually going to judge or deliberate on. And then they subsequently convicted him on your own defense team's definition. You now have waived any claim of error at this point. Neither argument persuades the court, is what he's saying. He said, first, Combs can bring his legal challenges under Rule 29, despite not raising them earlier. He can do that. He says, but these challenges are routinely made and decided by courts in this circuit, including the second itself. He said, second, Combs didn't waive his arguments concerning the definition of prostitution by proposing the instruction the court gave. To be sure, this case involves an unusual series of events. Combs proposed the instruction. The court adopted it. And now Combs says that it was wrong the whole time. He says, ordinarily, the invited error doctrine would bar this kind of challenge to the instructions. But Combs argues that his Rule 29 motion doesn't challenge the jury instructions, but instead turns on what the definition of prostitution should be. On that view, the jury instructions aren't relevant to his arguments. That's what he's saying. He's saying basically, Combs is arguing, Combs isn't challenging the jury instruction at all, the jury instructions, but instead he's having an issue with the definition of what prostitution should be. And by that, the jury instructions aren't relevant to his argument. So therefore, what would be the sense of you seeking an acquittal? Essentially, is what he's saying. He says, he goes on, let's get to some commentary here, because that was a lot. Now, he says another reason why that Combs's argument on Rule 29 doesn't hold weight is because of Combs's newly proposed definition of prostitution is wrong. He said Combs argues that prostitution properly defined has two elements absent from this case. First, the defendant must have a financial motive. Second, the exchange of money for SEX must be bilateral. Whoever pays for the SEX must engage in it. He said both arguments share a similar structure. Each posits that the definition of prostitution at the time of the Mann Act's passage was overboard in some respect. Then he suggests a way to narrow that definition to avoid potential constitutional problems. If Combs is right, then his convictions, even on an alternative theory, likely aiding and abetting, should be reversed because no prostitution occurred at all. But both arguments fail. That's why he said if Combs is right. And then he goes on to say, but he isn't right. And both of his arguments are failed. He said Combs got it right the first time, meaning he got it right during the jury instruction phase when his defense team tailored the definition. He said Combs got it right at that point. The correct definition of prostitution in the Mann Act is SEX in exchange for money or its equivalent. And that definition poses no constitutional problem. So that's the other reason why the Rule 29 fails, and it's a lot of legal jargon there, but I've given you the crust of it there. And moving on, and he very much concretes his arguments as to why this doesn't work for Combs, and he goes a long time on the second part of this. And then he says another reason, C, this is C, the other reason why there's an issue with Combs's argument is he says defining prostitution as sex for money doesn't create constitutional problems. He says it's not unconstitutional to do so. Nobody is, because, and I have to enlighten the audience here, because part of the argument from Miss Shapiro, which is Combs's legal counsel who argued this Rule 29 on Thursday was that um, the conviction violated his First Amendment right to be a pornographer, essentially. So Judge Submaranian says that defining prostitution as sex for money doesn't create constitutional problems. The reason why he's saying that is because the pornographer portion of the argument doesn't isn't even part of the prostitution. For nobody cares if you want to film whatever. The issue that we're having here is that you are paying someone commercially in exchange for an sex act. Regardless if you're participating in the sex act or not, you have facilitated the travel to transport for sex. So Judge Submaranian subsequently is saying for which the definition of prostitution for which it is does not create constitutional problems. So including a First Amendment violation should not even apply here. He says Combs argues that any definition of prostitution broader than the one he suggests would create constitutional problems. Specifically, he says that the statute would be void of vagueness, violate substantive due process rights, create federalism problems, and violate the First Amendment. Even though he makes all his arguments under the auspices of statutory interpretation, he also mounts a standalone challenge to his conviction under the First Amendment. None of these arguments are persuasive. None of these arguments is persuasive. Well, I would say are persuasive. Just Pomeranian said is, but I'll say are persuasive. And then he goes into each of those arguments that he just made here about the void of vagueness. And I mean he just goes on and he gets him. There's no way to, I would say there's no way to say that Judge Submaranian did not take time to really hammer in his reasonings for the denial. He was very thorough in his answer, essentially showcasing the equity and the parity that he put forth in the answer, that he considered many things or many different arguments as it relates to this answer. That he didn't just say, oh, denied and gone about my business. He took his time to address every single portion of this. Now, let me get down. I want to get down to the other, which is the Rule 33 of it all. Let me talk about this first. Now, the First Amendment. I'm going to go to the First Amendment because this is one thing that Ms. Shapiro brought up and it was very important. He says, Combs argues that because he's an amateur pornographer and consumer of pornography, that his conviction violates his First Amendment rights. This is exactly what I was telling you that Ms. Shapiro argued there during the hearing on Thursday. And then Justice Meridian says that argument fails for two reasons. He said, first, Combs' conduct, his conduct is not protected by the First Amendment. First Amendment protection applies only to conduct that is inherently expressive. Okay? You want to write something. You want to say something. You want to create something, but not this sort of creation of expression. He says, quote, conduct is inherently expressive if there's both an intent to convey a particularized message. Combs is not conveying a message here. He's just filming something he wants to see. And he goes on, he says, and the likelihood was great that the message would be understood by those who viewed it. Though film is an expressive medium protected by the First Amendment, at some point it must certainly be true that otherwise illegal conduct is not made legal by being filmed. So what does that mean? Basically, even though film is expressive medium protected by the First Amendment, that illegal conduct is not made legal because you're being filmed. So the illegal conduct here would be transporting sex workers to be filmed and participate in sex work for money to be filmed. That just because, oh, I'm just doing this, to express myself, doesn't sort of, nullify or resolute these people as the act that they're doing as not being illegal just because they're being filmed. The filming of it all does not therefore cleanse the conduct of Mr. Combs, which is paying for sex work, the facilitation, or the transports of sex workers or the facilitation thereof. So that is sort of the answer to Ms. Shapiro's argument there in the hearing. And then he goes on for I think I'm on page 13. He goes on for like 16 pages. Now, let's go to the evidence that supports the Rule 33. He says, there was sufficient evidence to convict under the definition that was adopted by the trial court that was introduced by Combs' team during the jury instruction phase. He said Combs' fact-based challenge also fails. He argues that the evidence wasn't sufficient to convict him under the definition of prostitution used at trial. He says to sustain a conviction under the Mann Act, one of the dominant purposes of the transportation must be for the transported individual to engage in prostitution. It need not have been his only purpose or motivation, but it must have been more than merely incidental. Combs' arguments all sound in the same tenor, that even if he paid escorts and they had sex with Ventura or Jane Doe, he didn't intend to pay for sex at the time of interstate travel. Instead, he meant to pay only for their time. If they ended up having sex, whoops, on that time, and even if it was foreseeable, it wasn't the object of the transaction. And Judge Subramanian is saying that's not good enough. That's not good enough because the case law, based upon Combs' own definition of what prostitution was, one that his team agreed to introduce to the trial court and then agreed to, is the fact that it had, under the Mann Act, one of the dominant purposes of transportation must be for the transported individual to engage in sex or in prostitution, and that it doesn't have to be the only purpose or motivation for the travel, but it has to be more than merely incidental. And Judge Subramanian is arguing it was merely more than incidental. Okay? And then he goes on and he talks about how Combs argues that the evidence at trial showed that sex was never part of the bargain. He points to evidence that the agencies that provided the escorts didn't advertise themselves, yada, 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 that they offered, companionship, yada, 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 or dancing and stripping services, yada, 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 but not sex. And that Combs was not aware of any details other than what we're doing, who's available, etc. But and then he goes on to say that, Combs is also arguing that at least one of the escorts also had sex with Ventura without payment and felt romantically attached to her, yada, yada, yada. And then Jane and Ventura sometimes describe the escorts as entertainers paid to entertainment, right? But Judge Subramanian goes on and he says the problem, though, for Combs is the court defers to the jury's choices of the competing inferences that can be drawn from the evidence, and that a great deal of evidence supported the competing inference that a dominant purpose of the transport was to pay for sex. Layman's terms is the problem is that the jury didn't believe you, and that the jury said that it was clear to them, and they made the inference, which is why they convicted, that the main purpose of these people coming to your hotel, uh, coming to whatever country you wanted them to come to, based on the evidence that was presented by both the defense and the Department of Justice, was basically that the jury just believed that they were there for SEX, and they knew well that Sean Combs was well informed that that's why they were there, and that he created this need. He created this opportunity based on sexual performance, and that the dominant purpose for the transportation was for Sean Combs to pay for sex, or for there to be payments at the behest of Sean Combs for sex. He goes on and he says, first, the evidence at trial showed that both parties to the transactions acted as if they were engaging in prostitution, that each side worried that the other side was an undercover police, a concern that wouldn't be relevant in Combs's intent hadn't been to pay for sex. He's saying basically, well, everybody knew that they were working under the guise of, oh, it's just entertainment, oh, it's just companionship, but everybody knew what this really was. And the reason for that was because each of the sides were concerned that the other was an undercover police informant or undercover police officer, and that there wouldn't be a need for concern, if Combs's intent hadn't been to pay for sex. Why would you be worried about that? Judge Submaranian says. Judge Submaranian goes on. He says at least one escort asked Combs whether he was a cop. Because remember, from the trial court phase, Combs never showed his face. He was in a full-on mask, sitting in the corner, watching the whole thing go down. So they never saw his face. So Judge Submaranian said, according to the trial court evidence, there was at least one escort who asked Combs whether he was a cop. And Combs had Cassie ask multiple escorts the same thing. Verbatim, Cassie said, hey, are you a cop? Sean wanted me to clarify if the person was a cop. Another point of issue with Combs's argument is that Combs believed, and this came out in the trial court phase as well, Combs believed that the escorts were frequently being tested for sexually transmitted diseases as part of their job. Per the Jane Doe text conversation, he just said, why wear a condom? These guys are safe. I'm sorry, this is per the Jane Doe testimony. Excuse me. He said, why wear a condom? These guys are safe. They get tested all the time. There would be no need for you to say that to Jane Doe as evidence to the contrary, that they didn't need to wear condoms, if in fact there was no intent to engage in paid sex with these people. The second part of that is Cassie Ventura testifying that the escorts were paid to release themselves, and to have sex with her, contrary to Combs's contention that they were just paid for their time and companionship. During the testimony, he was asked, Cassie Ventura was asked, for the escorts who you interacted with, what were they paid thousands of dollars to do? Cassie Ventura answered, to finish. Subsequent questioning, for all the dancers you interacted with, what were they paid to do? Cassie Ventura answered, to entertain and to also ultimately have intercourse with me. Even, Judge Submaranian goes on, he says, even the escort that Combs claims testified that he, in quote, wouldn't have thought twice to think it was prostitution, in quote, explicitly stated that he, on the stand, that is, that he was paid money for sex and wasn't paid when he couldn't actually perform. I talked about this in a couple episodes ago, that this notion that Sean Combs was never involved in the actual facilitation for sex, or that this was never a paid act of sex, was, is BS essentially, because there was at least one escort, sex worker, that got on that stand and said full well that he knew that he was coming there and being paid for sex. And Judge Submarinian brought up this very point in his answer. He said that the question was, what did Cassie Ventura give you money for in around 2012? He answered, to have sex with her. Jane then went on to testify that multiple men were routinely paid by Sean Combs after they finished having sex with her. Judge Submarinian then says, third, their compensation was tethered to the performance of that job. When escorts finish without having been told to do so, Combs, end quote, wasn't pleased by their performance, and they would take less money. You guys recall, I told you guys 2 episodes ago that Sean Combs actually called the Angels and Cowboys escort service himself, complaining about the escorts not performing. And that the escort agency said, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know what you're talking about, kind of like cop alert, sort of thing. And we can give you your money back. They're not there. They're just, what do you mean performance? They're just there for companionship. What are you talking about? So what was he talking about? He was talking about sex. And this is what Judge Submarinian is saying here. And then he goes on, he says, and fourth, even though some escorts who also spent time with Cassie Ventura and Combs outside of sexual activity, others engaged in sexual activity on every single trip with both Cassie Ventura and Jane. The testimony. This is Jane Doe. Question. Every time you met, not Jane Doe, the escort. Question. Every time you met with Miss Ventura and Mr. Combs, what was the purpose of the meeting? And the answer from this escort was to have sex with Cassie. Question to Jane Doe. Jane, in a typical hotel night, how would intercourse with an entertainer end? She answered, with them finishing on me. Question, at the end of each hotel night with Cabral, which is the name of an escort, what, if anything, did you give to Cabral? Jane answered and said money. And then he goes on and he says, Combs' other arguments, they fall flat, essentially. He said, yes, much of this evidence comes from after the escorts traveled, but it's still relevant and probative of Combs' intent beforehand. That the subsequent acts frequently probative as to intent. He intended, when he brought them there, he intended for them to have sex for money. And now on to the Rule 33. The Rule 33 is essentially the new trial request. And Judge Submarinian says the following. He said, no new trial is warranted under Rule 33. He says, Combs says that he should have a new trial because his RICO and sex trafficking counts shouldn't have been joined together with the Mann Act, shouldn't have been packaged together. He didn't like the way it was packaged together. He says these challenges are difficult to prevail on, much like Rule 29. He says, as a general matter, a Rule 33 motion must be granted only with great caution and in the most extraordinary circumstances, yet again, just like Rule 29. He says, on top of that, a defendant arguing prejudicial spillover bears an extremely heavy burden. Number one, whether the evidence that related to the dismissed charges was of a type that would incite or arouse the jury into convicting the defendant. And two, the similarities and differences between the evidence relating to the dismissed charges and evidence relating to the remaining charges. And then finally, three, the strength of the government's case on the remaining counts. The government argues that these factors shouldn't come into play and that Combs's argument should be summarily rejected because there's no precedent for a new trial based on retroactive misjoinder following a split jury verdict. Putting aside whether that's correct, Combs disagrees that it is correct, of course. It's certainly correct that Combs is asking the court to find retroactive misjoinder in an unusual circumstances. He says that Combs says that the evidence that was introduced on the RICO and SEX trafficking charges prejudiced him on the Mann Act to the jury. But he was acquitted on the RICO and the SEX trafficking charges. So his claim is that the jury was prejudiced against him because of the evidence of racketeering as SEX trafficking, but still didn't find him guilty on those same counts. And then he goes on and he says, as Combs concedes, the Second Circuit has never found spillover prejudice with the jury acquitted the defendant on the allegedly presidential charges. What is he saying? He's basically saying, Sean Combs, you're claiming that there was presidential spillover because the jury was prejudiced because on the Mann Act charges based on the other RICO and SEX trafficking charges. But you were acquitted on the more serious charges. So how can you then argue that they were prejudiced, the jury, that is, were prejudiced on those particular more serious counts to actually convict you of the Mann Act counts, but yet they acquitted you on the more serious counts? Judge Amaranian said that doesn't fly with me. He said that doesn't fly, he says. He says, as a result, the typical articulation of retroactive misjoinder is that it kicks in only after later developments, such as a district court's dismissal of some counts for a lack of evidence or an appellate court's reversal, meaning it would happen in a different court, essentially. A reversal of less than all convictions. Neither of these scenarios, he says, ponders a split verdict. Nevertheless, the court declines to summarily reject Combs's argument without reaching the test. Applying the relevant factors, Combs fails to carry his heavy burden of showing spillover prejudice. He says he doesn't meet the burden. Doesn't meet the burden. Doesn't meet the burden. And in conclusion, for these reasons, Combs's motion under Rules 29 and 33 is denied. So ordered, September 30th, 2025. And that's basically it, guys. That's it. Took us a while to get there, but that's it. I mean, it was 16 pages. I kind of went through, hit the high points for you, and really tried to give some translation, because there was a lot of case law in there. But that is essentially it. That is essentially it in a nutshell. Captain Court, TV, we called this weeks ago when we first heard about this, that we would likely be denied based on a few of the things we talked about, based on the fact that, Combs was obviously, involved in a lot of the transportation facilitation, but Judge Submaranian hit one of our big ones immediately, and that was the fact that Sean Combs didn't have a problem with the definition until he was convicted of the Mann Act. And now he wants to go back in time and say, well, actually, the definition that the defense that I actually, created and agreed to, I'm actually objecting to that now. I don't, it's not right. And Judge Submaranian said, nope, not allowed to do it. Not allowed. We're not going for that. Not going for it. All right, guys, that's it for this special edition of Cast and Court TV. We'll talk to you later. We'll get with you later on. We'll probably won't see you until the sentencing hearing on October 3rd. On Friday, we'll come back and give you the up to date, up to minute on what that sentencing hearing is. You will hear it from us. We will get the docs and we'll go through it and see exactly what goes down on October 3rd. If we receive a public recommendation from the Department of Probation, we may come back to you for that. But in the meantime, that is going to be it. And we will get with you guys soon. Thank you so much for joining Cast and Court TV. We appreciate it. Please don't forget to subscribe and like, and please help support the channel if you would like to. Of course, supporting the channel aids Cast and Court TV and getting all of these docs that you see us have, getting the information to you as quickly and as concisely as we can based upon our purchase of these official court documents. And we appreciate your time and your help in making this channel the success it is. Thank you so much, guys. We'll talk to you later. Peace.